Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry about the slight technical delay. We're going to make a start now. My name's Adrian Lee. I'm one of the Pro-Vice Chancellors at the University of Chester, and I'm delighted on behalf of the Vice Chancellor to welcome so many of you to the University and to extend a particularly warm welcome to the family and friends of Professor Emma Rees and to members of our University Council, our staff and students and guests from outside the University of Chester to this inaugural professorial lecture. Before we go any further, can I just address a couple of housekeeping matters? Could I ask you to switch off any mobiles or turn them to silent or other devices? And we have no fire drills planned tonight, so if there is an alarm, it will be genuine, and the fire exits are at either side of the auditorium. Just follow me quickly. We normally have 5 or 6 of these events each year, and they mark one of the high points of the academic career of colleagues who we've awarded professorial title to. We celebrate their appointment and their work, and we ask them to deliver an inaugural lecture to an invited audience of their colleagues and students and the public and their family and friends. It can be challenging to give a lecture to such a diverse audience and to make the subject both technically meaty enough for academic colleagues and at the same time accessible to non-specialists. Our speaker tonight and her topic are such that I'm sure that particular challenge will be met to everyone's satisfaction by a lecture that will be at once erudite, accessible and entertaining in the best traditions of the Department of English at Chester. For those that don't know her, let me go on to tell you something about Emma. She was educated at King Edward VI High School for Girls in Birmingham and the University of East Anglia, where she took her bachelor's degree in English, a doctorate in early modern literature, and she was appointed to her first academic post as a lecturer in English literature. Her doctoral thesis was on the politics of the exiled royalist philosopher Margaret Cavendish, and it eventually became her first book, Margaret Cavendish, Gender, Genre, Exile, which was published in 2004. By that time, Emma had joined the University of Chester as a lecturer, in 1999 to be precise. She was quickly promoted to senior lecturer in 2001. Since then, she's served the university as a programme leader of several programmes, as deputy head of department from 2004 to 2010, as university teaching fellow and research coordinator for the English department. She became the founding director of the university's Interdisciplinary Institute of Gender Studies last year, and she's been a regular contributor to the university's Diversity Festival fortnight, which for 2017 reaches its final day tomorrow. So we're particularly pleased that Emma's lecture, with its topic so central to current equality issues, falls within the festival events. But these posts and achievements don't begin to convey the depth, breadth and quality of Emma's teaching and research interests and the extent of her publications. She's been writing about gender and culture for over 20 years and is steeped in reading and writing about feminism. She's an active, widely published researcher, the author of 2 scholarly monographs, and she's currently writing a 3rd due for publication next year. The second of these books has sold thousands of copies in various formats worldwide and has been widely reviewed. She's an international speaker, curator, organiser and host of the Talking Bodies Project, a regularly commissioned writer for the Times Higher Educational Supplement, a consultant for the Oxford English Dictionary. She writes book reviews for a range of journals including Gender and Education, Psychology and Sexuality, and Jewish Culture and History. And she's on the editorial boards of Gender Forum, of the Journal of Feminist Scholarship, and of Writing from Below, an Australian interdisciplinary gender, sexuality and diversity studies journal. She's nominated or shortlisted by our students each year for the annual Above and Beyond Teaching Awards. And in 2014, for example, she was shortlisted in the categories of Most Inspiring Lecturer, Most Outstanding Postgraduate Supervisor, and Best Personal Academic Tutor, and she won in this last category. In 2015, she became the university's first female public orator, writing encomia for honorary graduates and delivering them at our graduation ceremonies to audiences of around 1,600 people in Chester Cathedral. In the same year, 2015, her personal chair was conferred and she became Professor of Literature and Gender Studies. 2 years earlier, in 2013, her second book, entitled The Vagina, A Literary and Cultural History, had been published by Bloomsbury. It was commended by Naomi Wolf. The Independent on Sunday described it as the book you've been waiting for. Although Rees is an academic by trade, the book gleefully mixes highbrow and lowbrow from Chaucer to 21st century horror. I'm sure you've all read it. It was the book of the week in the Times Higher, which thought the book was the kind of work we need more of. And these are no more than a tiny selection of the quotes on the book's impact. Her new book, tentatively called Not a Feminist, But, is expected to be published next year and will explore current debates in feminism, including how some feminists themselves can cause division. In June 2016, she became the first ever political writer in residence at Gladstone's Library, Harden, formerly St Daniel's, where she ran a workshop entitled Fractured Feminism, and she's delivered her talk, Vulvanomics, based on her book, at more than 30 venues and events on both sides of the Atlantic, and she hosts the university's biennial international interdisciplinary Talking Bodies conferences. The next conference, for those who want more, is scheduled for next month. She's published on subjects as varied as Charlotte Bronte's Villette, Shakespeare's King Lear and Titus Andronicus, Freud and Led Zeppelin, Aristotelian ethics, and The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Now, the Led Zeppelin reference clearly suggests a love for a particular musical genre. Emma tells me she has seen Metallica 30 times, but so far as I know, her hearing remains unimpaired. And as you might expect, she has similar staying power and determination for the works of Shakespeare. Emma and Richard, her soulmate of 29 years, recently completed their Shakespeare Odyssey, seeing every one of his 37 plays live on stage at least once. Emma's other passion is Tottenham Hotspur Football Club. Careful. And she explained the connection between her choice of club to support and Shakespeare in a Times Higher article published in 2014. That's the homework for tonight. Emma and Richard are parents to Saf, who is now 25, and we wish Emma, Richard, Saf and their guests a memorable and most enjoyable evening. I'm going to leave the last word on Emma to someone closer to her and to her work than me, the former head of the Department of English at Chester, Professor Chris Walsh, who wrote in support of the learning and teaching aspect of Emma's professorial application that she is an exceptionally talented and committed teacher. In a department with no shortage of pedagogically impressive and innovative teachers, Emma Rees stands out as one of the very best. It is hard to avoid superlatives in writing about Emma. Everything she does is done energetically, thoughtfully, and meticulously. I have observed Emma teach, watched her perform in a variety of public settings, for example, the Chester Literature Festival, and monitored enviously programme and module evaluations by her students. She is a vivacious, scintillating lecture theatre presence and a warmly supportive tutor in private. Would you please welcome Professor Emma Rees to give her inaugural professorial lecture, Who Broke Feminism? The Obligation of Privilege.
Thank you ever so much, Adrian, for that intro. It was really very, very generous, and in keeping with my passion for a particular musical genre, I just want to do a quick sound check. Alex, are you on the ball? Okay. Two. Perfect. Okay, I just had to do that. I do apologise. So yes, thank you for that introduction. I've got other thanks that I want to make to as well at the beginning here. I want to thank three people from corporate comms particularly, Jane Dodgson, Jenny Westcott and Amy Owens, for their behind-the-scenes support and hard work. An event like this doesn't just happen. It takes an awful lot of work from an awful lot of people. I also want to thank colleagues in AV, particularly Alex, despite the fact that he told me earlier he was manning the camera. Alex, pay attention. I also want to thank Charlie and Pam and Emma from catering, because obviously they're staying behind on a Thursday evening to look after us and to support us. And housekeeping, who've worked so hard to get everything set up and sorted out for this evening. I also want to thank, of course, the family and friends who have travelled so far, so many of you, to be here. My former colleague and current friend, Judy, has travelled further than anyone. She's done a 9,000-mile round trip to be here, and that's friendship right there. Other people have come from further afield. As those of you who know where I live, you'll know that my own commute was stressful, strenuous. I left in perfectly good time and managed to make it nonetheless. So I want to talk about feminism. I want to think about who broke it and who might mend it, what some of those solutions might be. I want to start with a quotation from a particular feminist hero of mine, a woman called Audrey Lord, and she'll be somebody with whom many of you perhaps are familiar. She died in 1992 and left behind a really important body of feminist work. And this quotation comes from a text that she published in 1983. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And I'll explain why I want to take that as my starting point tonight. It encapsulates some of the contradictions and continuities of the fact that I'm standing here on this platform right now today. The paradox of being a feminist academic in a 21st century British university. What Lord's doing here, of course, is emphasising diversity. She was rightly a critic of white academic feminism and urged feminists to challenge the very structures that underpin patriarchy more broadly. She was acknowledging that those structures that we have to work with are also the ones that we have to work within and on. In a sense, what Lord is doing here is saying feminism was already broken as far as she was concerned. She was urging us to continue to consider how our personal lives can be part of a wider political continuum. She acknowledges too that we need to be aware that if we thrive, it can very often be at the expense of somebody else, and we need to be aware of that. What does it mean, she asks in this same essay, when the tools of a racist patriarchy are used to examine the fruits of that same patriarchy? It means, she said, that only the most narrow parameters of change are possible and allowable. This statement, that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, I understand as far from being a statement of resignation or inaction as an incitement to uncomfortable analysis, looking for new tools, new models of support and solidarity. And that means that me standing here from Lord's perspective is a contradiction and perhaps an uncomfortable one. Let me explain that a bit more. I've been made Professor of Literature and Gender Studies by a university like all universities everywhere. has serious structural issues in terms of gender and equality. Chester is working very hard to address those issues. There's an awareness of them. As Adrian suggested, this is part of a diversity festival, but at the same time, those issues are still there. There's still a long way to go at Chester, and again, I'd say that's true of every university currently. Lord's message that sexism, homophobia, racism, and other forms of oppression need to be challenged even at great personal cost has got to be heeded. She argued that difference should be seen as enriching rather than threatening. Academia, she was saying, traditionally excluded women, especially women of colour. The master's tools are those categories that construct the other, women included, as dangerous. Those categories of sexism, homophobia, racism, ableism, and classism. And I take that further to say that I think the master's tools are also those institutions, like all universities, that are master's houses, that can sometimes perpetuate precisely these divisive categories that Lord identified. What or who did break feminism then? By identifying the breaks in feminism, we ought to be able to mend them, to reconfigure feminism, crucially, as a vital political and social movement. That idea of its coherence as a political movement has, I think, kind of begun to move away from us, and I want to kind of bring that back into the picture. Some of the culprits will be not unexpected then. Some minor, small structures here that perhaps are on our most wanted list. These are big themes that we're dealing with. If by 7:30, 8 o'clock, we can have sorted out capitalism and neoliberalism, I think that would be a result for the evening, frankly. So these are the possible culprits. There's not actually a $100,000 reward. I'm sorry, that's not happening. Is that 100,000? It's $1 million. Oh, there's one of those, yes. No, that's fine. That's okay. So, let's unpick some of my own privileges, roles, and contradictions first by asking, what is a professor? And how have all of these fractures, these breaks, these culprits, these suspects, perhaps broken the idea of a professor as well? The first port of call, of course, for any kind of research, and I'm looking for Louisa here particularly, who works in a library, is that I miss libraries. I like big books, and I cannot lie. However, now, of course, people do go to Google. And so I thought, well, Google is clearly the oracle of our time. What is Google going to tell me about what makes a professor? So I put it into Google image, and this is what came up on the first page. In today's outfit, I feel a little like I could work at Hogwarts. It's quite a strange feeling. They're just an extraordinary selection of images. Professor Green, I'm not sure what he's professor of. Any young people may be able to tell me. I do know, don't worry, it's okay. Some of them are looking quite as if we must tell her afterwards. She needs to know that he's a singer and not a professor. I'm okay, I'm on that, Becky. McGonagall, as we know, Hogwarts, Professor X. From, where's Bryony? Yeah, from the Marvel franchise. Oh, good, I don't get this wrong in front of Bryony. And somebody called Snape. I've no idea where he's from. Saf, is Saf anywhere? Where's Saf? Yeah. Does it ring a bell with you at all? Yeah, not bad. Okay. I think it's the Twilight series, isn't it? Yeah, good. And of course, the mad professor, wonderfully unethically ethically dubious construct there. But even if we acknowledge that every single one of those across the top, presumably the top hits on the Google image of a professor, are fictional, then by the time we get to the pictures underneath, this must be the truth. This must be what a professor is. And it seems to me that there are certain key qualifications that you need in order to be a professor. Okay? You need to have a blackboard behind you. I'm failing. You need to have receding hairline. Also failing. You need to wear a tie. I don't think I've ever owned one. You need to look earnest. I can do that. And you need to have a stick. A little bit jealous of this, because a lot of them, in order to professor correctly, it requires a stick, I'm guessing a wand in some instances. It becomes very readily apparent to me that I'm not actually professoring correctly, and that is dangerous to say in front of the university lawyer, because it is all sorted now, yeah? So what is this message? It's a message of cultural homogeneity. And the suggestion is that in this culture, just by identifying as a woman professor, before I've written or spoken a single thing, I'm already an anomaly, an agitator, a contradiction. Well, how does that play out in the UK higher education sector more broadly? How much of an anomaly is a professor who's also a woman today? This is a report that was written in 2016 in collaboration with the government. And they did a breakdown of women leaders in higher education in the UK. And we need to remember, as we look at these diagrams, that over 50% nationally of the undergraduate student body is female students, over 50% of them, okay? So this is how the professorships break down in the UK in 2016. So what you can see there is that 23% of professors across 166 higher education institutions in 2016 were women. 50% of the students are women. There's clearly a mismatch, a discontinuity that's going on here. Now, universities are run by governors, boards of people who obviously oversee everything, perhaps like a board of trustees, maybe like a school governor, people who have in effect the power, the sign-off, the last word. So let's have a think about how that works. From the same report, we can see the distribution of female governors throughout the UK. We'll focus on England because that's where the University of Chester is. And you can see that 36% of governors in the UK, in England, are female governors. There are around 3,300 governors in UK higher education institutions, and 36% of those are women. Chairs of governing bodies as well. You can see 17% in England there. The report's great because it drills down and does some statistics around each and every one of these 166 higher education institutions. You can see how it breaks it down here. Who comes out on top? I was quite interested to see that the University of Brighton came out on top. So you can see that 59% of their governors are female at the University of Brighton, or they were in 2016 when the report was last put together. I'm also always, I don't know if you do this with such reports, but you always look for your alma mater. You always think, oh, I wonder how they're doing without me. And so I had a look at UEA, and ain't doing so well, as you can see here. They've got 17 governors, and 6 of those are women. I also, and I hope it's not just me, but I always want to know who's doing the worst. Do you do that with tables too? Yeah, okay. It's not Chester. You'll be relieved, we're doing pretty well. The worst, oh no, sorry, that's a mistake. Oxford, because that's the other one I'm always interested in looking at, you can see is doing just pretty well. They have 26 governors, 9 of those are women, but look at who the chair of the governing body and vice-chancellor is. That's quite revelatory and important. The lowest on the table then have 14 governors, and they've allowed 1 woman governor on their board. You might guess from the gap on the slide that our own institution fits into the middle here. In 2016, there were 25 governors of the University of Chester, and 9 of those were women. That's 36% of the governors were women. So you can see that these structural issues of inequality are across the board. There really is a problem in HE. It would be a mistake, and of course it would be going against Audrey Lord's reasoning to assume that the issue lies in how many women are or are not promoted in UK universities, as though women was a sufficient category in and of itself. It isn't, of course, an homogenous category. So there's another organisation called the Runnymede Trust. It's a racial equality think tank. And this is where we start to think about intersectionality, the fact that issues of ableism, of sexuality, of class, of all kinds of things make human beings who they are, not just the gender that they most closely identify with. So in 2015, the Runnymede Trust, the think tank, published a really interesting report that's salutary reading. And they were very keen to emphasize intersectionality, particularly with an emphasis on class and race. And what you can see, that very much in keeping with Audrey Lord's ethos that people are messy and contradictory and we must take race into account, will hopefully shock you. I'll read it to you. 92.39% of professors in UK academia are white, and 0.49% are black, with just 17 of those being women. Look at those numbers alone without the percentages. There are 15,905 professors in this country at the time that this report was written. Of those 15,905 professors, there are 15,905 white professors. There are 85 black professors in 2015. And there are 17 of those 15,905, that's almost 16,000, no, that's the white ones, who are black women. White professors 15,905, black professors 85, 17 black women professors. There are clearly important structural issues at play in these very privileged institutions in which we operate. The media is keen to tell us that feminism is broken, and actually, to some extent, I agree, because I think white academic feminism isn't doing its job properly yet in acknowledging some of these greater issues around race and identity. So, what are the signals that the media is giving us? The Spectator is reassuring. We can all go home now, actually, except there's free wine afterwards, so let's not. Feminism is over. The battle is won. Time to move on. Well, thank goodness for that. I hate this cartoon that they've got here. The suffragettes are incredibly important, and the Spectator thinks so, but is holding them up as, I think, something they weren't. So the image on the left left there is a traditional suffragette. She's holding up her votes for women. The 21st century feminist is just about every contradiction, a confirmation of this sort of parodic image of feminism that you could think for. She's scribbled with her spray can, because clearly she's a reckless vandal, all men are scum. And you can see that she is screaming rather than being composed. She probably hasn't even shaved her armpits, because these are all symptomatic, you understand, of being a feminist. Good. I'm pleased to hear this. And actually, again, it can curtail not only our evening, but my career. The patriarchy is dead. And I like that Hannah Rosen tells us feminists accept it. I'm surprised she doesn't say feminists accept it, love. And Giorgio Armani doesn't hold back from advertising some perfume on the same page against a little picture of some roses, because the ladies like the perfume. A very up-to-date one is one of my least favourite individuals at the moment, Kellyanne Conway. This is very, very recent, and she tells us that she is a feminist, but she's not that kind of feminist. She's a conservative feminist. This interview is actually really interesting. If you can access it in the Washington Post, then do. I'm guessing that you're a fairly self-selecting audience, apart from family, who of course are forced to be here, but the rest of you are self-selecting, and hopefully you will perhaps follow up on this article to see. We need to remember who she works for and how he grabs the attention of women, and how Kellyanne Conway buys into that kind of power dynamic. It's another interesting contradiction. She sees sexism, she fails to see sexism not only as an action by an individual, but actually as symptomatic of bigger institutional structural problems again. She really doesn't get it. But if we don't believe that feminism is broken, and you see that all three of these articles are written by women who tell us that feminism is over, then there must be something else going on. And that takes us back to our wanted poster. Neoliberalism depends on two key tenets. The first is that it wants to harbour privilege without making it clear that that's what it's doing. It wants privilege to remain hidden, under wraps, not exposed. You shouldn't see the workings of it, because then it can't do what it needs to do. The second thing it depends on is that the people with the privilege want it to remain hidden because they don't want to share it. They don't want to give it away. And so they will do almost anything they can in any discourse, including making certain philosophies appear somehow natural to us, to make us say, well, that's just the way it is. No, it isn't. We can change stuff. I'd argue that the phenomena of feminism light and choice feminism are absolutely part of the neoliberal continuum that are set up, particularly in the media, to divert us from those bigger socio-economic structural issues that need to be tackled. I'll give you some examples of how feminism light and choice feminism are presented to us. This is the most pressing issue in the world today, okay? And it's one to which we must all give serious consideration. This is the essence of feminism. I don't know if you can see the byline. The byline's Hadley Freeman. Underneath, we're told that this is Michelle Obama's shoes. Michelle Obama's low heels are the perfect feminist compromise. Because feminism should be all about heels and compromise. That's the bottom line. Okay? What else are we told? This is kind of reassuring. Those of you who were alive and well and interested in feminism in the 1960s, and those of us who have read about this stuff from the 1960s will be thinking, has this argument really just not moved on at all? Is this really? But again, I'll go back to this point that neoliberalism is very happy for us to tinker around with these important issues, because then we ain't looking at the bigger picture. I didn't bother to read the 6 reasons, but I also love makeup, so I don't know, I'm clearly conflicted. I like this one too. I think I liked it because it has the expression penis straws in it. And penis straws is not a phrase I say every day, so I'm going to say it just once more gratuitously. Penis straws. This is quite a recent one, and again, to embarrass her horribly, Emma Watson is a sort of idol is a too strong a word, but my daughter really respects Emma Watson, and I think Emma Watson has some wonderful things to say. She did a Vanity Fair shoot before she did this Beauty and the Beast press conference quite recently, and wore some clothing where you could see her breasts. I know, I'm sorry. Would you like to go back to the penis straws? And she was called out on it because you may not show your breasts in order to be a feminist. There's a theme emerging here about it's not them, it's not corporations, it's not inequality, it's not neoliberal, it's us. We're getting it wrong. We're not doing the feminism right. I've already discovered I'm not doing professoring right. Clearly, I'm a complete fraud. And my own personal favourite. I can't even begin to tell you the number of nights of sleep that I have lost. Worrying about the compatibility between whether I've remembered to shave my legs, whether I can be bothered to shave my legs, and frankly in the winter, who can be? Well, it's what thick tights and leggings are for. And the idea that this is where feminism is profoundly worrying. I'm going to add this one actually to my list of things to feel inadequate about for next week. So if any of you would like to join me in debating this, we can do so. The fact is then that feminism light and choice feminism are a tinkering about at the edges. They are distractions that absolutely suit dominant power structures, and they think it's just fine if, to use an old metaphor, we're worrying about our heels, our legs, our penis straws, Emma Watson's outfits, rather than thinking about bigger issues. To use that old image, they want us to be concerned about the configuration of the deck chairs on board the Titanic because they don't want us to look at the enormous iceberg that is just around the corner. Against this background of voices claiming that this is feminism, we need to think again about those structural issues. And one of the most vivid ways to convey capitalism, neoliberalism, and the power structures of the patriarchy is by a series of very cheesy photo calls. Every year, as you'll know, the most powerful individuals in the country meet at various summits. The G8 and the G20, the World Finance Ministers meet. And as you may also know, every year they do have this cringe-worthy, hey, we're all really happy together and we've had profitable talks and it's all going to be fine. But what I've done is just take some images from over the last 30 years to think about technology. I'm just going to go over here to think about what those look like. So here are just some images from over the last 30 years. Occasionally, they'll let a Margaret Thatcher and Angela Merkel. I think in the top right-hand corner we've got Christine Lagarde if it's a finance minister's meeting. But this is what power actually looks like and has looked like for 30 or 40 or 50 years. This is what power looks like. And many of us, men and women, do not look like this. They're remarkably, as well as this homogeneous display of maleness, there's also conformity, there's a degree of ableism that's going on there. These are not a diversity of individuals. This is structural inequality because these are the people with the real power and they do not look like and they do not like you and me. So how do we begin to tackle those structural inequalities? And this is where the second part of my title about the obligation of privilege really comes into play. There's a rather wonderful scholar called Peggy McIntosh, and many of you will be familiar with her work. She was writing in America in the 1980s, and she says that I see white privilege as a bank account that I did not ask for, but that I can choose to spend. A bank account that I didn't ask for, but I can choose to spend. That's privilege. And McIntosh also told us this. She set up this wonderful metaphor of the invisible knapsack. She draws parallels between white privilege and male privilege, so she's questioning her own in two different ways. She wrote, thinking about unacknowledged male privilege as a phenomenon, have come to see white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. White privilege is like an invisible weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks. And so many of us have this bank account that we didn't ask for, but that we choose to spend. We have the special maps and code books that we weren't really aware that we had. But we have to be aware that we're carrying these around with us, because otherwise we're not going to see the people that don't get to carry them around with them. So we need to think about this in terms of women globally. The people with the privilege need to acknowledge it. Frighteningly, for some of them, need to be willing to relinquish some of it. And that's how things can change more broadly. So if we reject feminism light, and if we begin to acknowledge our privilege, we need to look instead at the structures that specifically disempower women. And it's interesting that if we do agitate for equality, we will get called out, and many of us in this room have been in one way or another. Many of us will have had pretty obnoxious people on social media, particularly being unkind to us, and that's a polite way to put it. We may even have friends in good-natured discussions in the pub who will say, well, why on earth would you identify as a feminist? Or in print, indeed. So why feminism? Why is that so important? And I think one of the best answers to that comes from a Nigerian writer who did a wonderful TEDx talk that then turned into a book. And in 2014, she wrote, "We should all be feminists." This is what she says in response to the question, why the word feminist? Why not just say you are a believer in human rights or something like that? And the way that she replies is that because that would be dishonest. Feminism is, of course, part of human rights in general, but to choose to use the vague expression human rights is to deny the specific and particular problem of gender. It would be a way of pretending that it was not women who have for centuries been excluded. It would be a way of denying that the problem of gender targets women, that the problem is not about being human, but was specifically about being a female human. And that's absolutely worth thinking about. So what are some of these specifically gendered issues, such as those about which Adichie talks? The one that I want to think about is FGM. This is female genital mutilation. My colleague and dear friend Caroline, who works in, identify yourself, who works in the law department, is one of the leading campaigners who is talking about FGM at the moment. She's a total inspiration. And what's interesting about female genital mutilation is quite how pervasive it is. Statistically, at this moment, while we're sitting comfortably in this room, there are 200 million women living throughout the world who have had their clitoris, their labia, their cut off, their vulvas sewn up, who've had the most ghastly and appalling and unpleasant things done to them without their consent. And it presents all sorts of difficulties, pain, infection. It's just horrendous. But we live in the same planet as 200 million women who are living with that. This is a problem of gender that targets women. Every year in Africa, through about 30 countries, 3,300,000 women are annually at risk from having these things done to their bodies without consent. The problem of gender targets women. In this country, right now, in England and Wales, there are 137,000 women who have had this done to their bodies. 137,000. And I was talking to a wonderful woman called Heba Wadari, who's written a book called Cut, because she experienced FGM as I think she was a 6-year-old, didn't understand what was going on, and is very, very open and honest about it now, wonderful campaigner, and just talked about the absolute terror of this form of brutal child abuse. Sometimes statistics can feel a little bit kind of abstract, so I kind of tried to think of a way of how am I going to convey 137,000 people living in England and Wales, where many of us live, that are walking around like this. This room may look slightly familiar. The way I thought about it, and bear with me, is that, no, I was going to say at 20 past 8, but actually 20 past 7, but actually without warning. The doors will be blocked, and that door will be blocked, and somebody will come to that door with several other strong people. They will take you from your seat. It's not really going to happen, don't worry, Adrian, we're not going to get sued. They will take you from your seat. They will drag you outside against your will. They will take a rusty blade, and they will just chop off the tip of your left finger on your little finger on your left hand. And then the next one of us will be taken outside, and so on and so forth. Okay? Now, if that happened to this room full of people every day, how many days do you think, once every day, how many days do you think it would take to reach 137,000? I don't do numbers, I do words, so I went to my glamorous assistant, who's sitting in the front row, my rather wonderful husband, and I said, how does that work? And he did some stuff with numbers. And he said that it would mean filling this room as it is today, every day, for that to be done to our little fingers to be cut off with a rusty blade, for each one of us against our will, until the end of June. Every single day. June 2018. 2018. That is what 137,000 women living in England and Wales who've had something done to their bodies that they did not want to have done, that has caused them untold problems. That is the reality of that situation. There is a war on women. The war doesn't always come from culture, from structure, from men. Sometimes women don't help either. And now for the ridiculous. There's an internet group called Women Against Feminism. It began in the summer of 2013 on Tumblr, which the youth tell me is a thing. It now has well over 42,000 followers on Facebook, where the group's description, self-description, is that they're tackling women's voices against modern feminism and its toxic culture. what's really amusing and interesting to me about Women Against Feminism is that for these women to be able to articulate the fact in public that they're against feminism, they're depending on the fact that for an awfully long time, feminists has been fighting for them to have the right to be able to do this. They don't get it that way. The journalist Katie Harrington in 2014 said, I think rather nicely, women against feminism is mystifying really, because being anti-feminism is like being pro-apartheid or a big fan of social injustice. But no one would think it's cute to hold up a sign saying that. And they do. They hold up, this is their kind of USP, they hold up these signs that tell us about why they don't need feminism. There's no patriarchy. I'm not oppressed. I appreciate the differences between men and women. And this one I think is very revealing. I don't need feminism because I love men. All of my friends are men. I'm sure they are love, frankly. So what I decided to do was to choose one of these women in particular. And I did kind of hum and haw about this because it felt slightly unfair. But then I thought she has deliberately chosen to put herself out on this platform and to boast. She's bought into the doctrine of Women Against Feminism and has said, I want to be part of this. I want to put my message out there. I want to be a public face on the internet. So I've zoomed in on this woman that we have here. And I want to sort of deconstruct the privilege that's operating in her statement in Women Against Feminism. So, what are the various privileges that this woman is unwittingly demonstrating here? The first, I'd argue, is that she appears to be white. I don't know her ethnicity, but the insignia of her racial identity in our culture suggest whiteness. And I think that's, as we've seen from Audrey Lord and from Peggy McIntosh, that is privilege. Additionally, for all her frankly appalling handwriting, her grammar, her punctuation and her syntax are pretty spot on. So she tells us, because she can write and therefore has had an education, that she doesn't need feminism. She's exhibiting her literacy and she's also exhibiting her resources there. She has the capacity to go out, to buy a notepad, to have pens, to be able to write, to articulate, to punctuate. Her takeaway message is, do I look oppressed? And then there's this very handy little arrow, I don't know if you can see it there, pointing to the I that isn't oppressed at all. And then the whole thing, of course, depends upon the fact that she's been able to write this message, access a group, get a clear photograph of herself taken, live in a culture where electricity is predictable and around for 24 hours, have the internet, upload the image and put it out there. Those are all forms of privilege. Let's look at each of those in turn to see just how privileged they are. We'll start with this insignia of racial identity. Women's Aid tell us that there is no evidence to suggest that women from some ethnic or cultural communities are more at risk than others. However, women from Black, Asian or minority ethnic communities are likely to face additional barriers to receiving the help that they need. Their experiences may be compounded by racism, and Women's Aid say, which is pervasive in the UK. So her insignia of racial identity are signs of unacknowledged privilege. I talked about her access to literacy and pens and paper, things that we take for granted. We're told by UNESCO that the global literacy challenge is gendered. For the past 2 decades, women have accounted for approximately 2/3 of all illiterate adults, and the gender gap is nearly as wide among young people. Women's literacy rate remains stubbornly high at 477 million, falling just 1% since 2000. And listen to this, half the adult women in South and West Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa cannot read or write. Literacy and the resources are a privilege. Her takeaway message, not much really needs to be said about that. She has, finally, her clear photo and internet access in order to be able to spread her message to us. And the World Wide Web Foundation tells us last year that a long path to digital equality lies ahead. A majority of the over 4 billion people still offline today are women. And recent International Telecoms Union data show that the gender digital divide is growing wider, particularly in the world's least developed countries, which show a 31% gap between men's and women's internet use. There are another two images that relate to what I was saying earlier about how we can be concerned about some things when actually there are other things that are altogether more pressing. How do we mend feminism then? Education has got to be the key. We've got to keep talking about this stuff. We've got to keep being the little pebble in the toe, in the boot of patriarchy. That means eventually they're going to have to take that boot off and shake the pebble out and address it rather than ignoring it. We've got to move away from globalization, that homogenizing capitalist attempt at saying, hey, we're all one globe now. It's very different to a kind of healthy global thinking. And we need to see a continuum that a rather wonderful writer called Carol Hanisch saw again in 1969. She was fab. She was a member of a group in New York called the Red Stockings. And one of the things they did quite famously was disrupt the Miss America pageants in the late 60s. And she wrote this essay that has become known as The Personal as Political, although she claims she didn't actually come up with the title. Personal problems are political problems. There are no personal solutions at this time. There is only collective action for a collective solution. Collective action for a collective solution. Perhaps the mending is beginning to happen. Perhaps we can see that happening right now because of the urgency of the geopolitical global situation. You'll know about the Women's March. This took place there were 700 marches worldwide on every continent, including Antarctica. And if you think there are some people, some of us sometimes, who can't be bothered to get out if it's a little bit chilly, remember those women and allies in Antarctica who took part in the Women's March. They had some really rather wonderful and powerful placards. And this one I particularly liked because I think it's frustrating that so much work has already been done. We're standing on the shoulders of feminist giants, and yet we have to keep, it would appear, reinventing the wheel. But Carol Hanisch, remember, is saying this about collective action for a collective solution in 1969, which is a good 15 years ago, yeah, about that, in order to see somebody saying we're fighting the same battles, the same fights. So those frustrations about the bigger structural issues are not changing. I want to finish by reading you a little bit from the book that Adrian mentioned. He came up with an earlier working title, actually. It's really frustrating. I had the best title, like, totally ever, which was Feminist Fight Club. And then somebody said to me, have you seen this amazing new book called Feminist Fight Club that's coming out? And I said, you're a little bit premature, but thanks. And they said, no, there is a book called Feminist Fight Club that's coming out. So that went off the drawing board. There's a very recent book out, Erica's here somewhere, and there's a recent book that's basically I'm Not a Feminist, and the working title was I'm Not a Feminist But. So apparently that could cause confusion. So the current title for the book is That is a Feminist Issue. If anybody takes that outside of this room, I will hunt you down. Because if I lose that title as well now, it's just going to be awful. I don't know if I've got another title in me. So I'm going to read to you just to finish off with. Collectivity education and consciousness raising won't solve social, structural and cultural inequalities, but they will equip us to ask of capitalist patriarchy the question it fears above all others. Why? Think about it. Why questions an awful lot of assumptions? And the neoliberal status quo depends on the apathy that unquestioned assumptions breed. Why is there an obesity crisis and widespread famine on the same little planet? Why do some women who don't want to participate in pornography still do so? Why, in some sectors of the media, are famous women not praised for their achievements, but rather are derided for being too fat, too thin, too frumpy, too old? Why isn't there a contraceptive pill for men? Why do some men hurt women? Why does someone keep recommissioning Keeping Up with the Kardashians? Why, in the UK, do 9 out of 10 heterosexual women in relationships still do more housework than their partners? Why is breastfeeding in public seen by some as dirty? Why is my womb subject to your legislation? Why, the clicker's over here, I don't think anyone's noticed. Why are you willing to spend £490? That'll be £490 on a t-shirt from Dior without demanding to know how much money the woman who made it is actually going to get to take home with her. We collectively need to be adult versions of that irritating kid in the supermarket. You know, the one, she asks, why? And having been answered or fobbed off, asks, why? Again and again. Good girls don't ask why. Let's not be good girls anymore. Logically, if oppression and sexism exist in our individual personal lives, there's no earthly reason why they won't exist in our collective political ones too. But isn't it really exhausting to be our own CCTV cameras, to engage in self-surveillance 24/7? Why can't our personal lives be just that? Full of guilty pleasures, full of dubious sexual fantasies, full of ethical contradictions. Our personal lives are actually far less personal than we might like to think. Another neoliberal trick. And that's why what we wear, read, eat and watch, buy, drive and clean with are all under scrutiny. Domestic life can be just as oppressive as public life, regardless of who we share it with. This means that injustices are endured and vital structural political changes remain unquestioned. If we're not careful, we relax under a kind of oppression that's sold to us as benign until we're completely ensconced in a comfy world of Netflix and Lycra and latte, and we get stuck there because, let's face it, it's not a bad way to spend the time. We float quite merrily in a miasma of quilted loo paper and bottled water and plug-in air fresheners with packaging that says hazardous to wildlife, and capsule coffee machines with plastic capsules that aren't recyclable, and scented panty liners and scatter cushions. When this happens, we lose sight of other women and of the world and of our authentic selves. I'm absolutely not saying that we should march on Joe Malone with pitchforks demanding to see the manager to get a refund for all the scented candles we suddenly feel we've been duped into buying down the years. Actually, green tomato leaf, totally foul, and I would like a refund for that one. It's horrible. What I am saying is that we should open our eyes, act like the responsible adults we all are, be aware again of how our choices sometimes aren't choices at all. So capitalism and neoliberalism top the West's most wanted list. They're the biggest culprits when it comes to fostering in us a sense of false consciousness. Now, sociologists call housework and childcare the second shift. More women than men still put in a second shift. Additionally, many women from the poorer socioeconomic backgrounds put in a second shift as carers or cleaners or nannies for women doing the second shift. Naomi Wolf wrote a brilliant book in the early 90s called The Beauty Myth, in which she pointed out that many women also work a third shift. The third shift is of plucking, shaving, bleaching, polishing, relaxing, straightening, curling, shading, dyeing, dieting, starving, purging, blending, moisturizing, cleansing, toning, exfoliating, plumping, filling, abrading, containing, and perfuming. So if you're a woman, chances are that you're working 3 or 4 shifts. And the possibility is, given that in the UK alone, over 27% of all women will experience domestic violence at some point in their lives. 27% of all women in the UK alone will experience domestic violence at some point in their lives, that you're being physically, sexually or emotionally abused in between that first, second, and third shift. If this is the life for so many women, then feminism's job is in no way over. Everywhere, women are still conforming to and being judged on impossibly, unrealistically, pointlessly high standards at home and at work and in and on their bodies. Because those standards are impossibly, unrealistically, pointlessly high, women by definition fail. Appalling things continue to be done to women in their personal lives and in their public lives, whether they live in Hoxton or Damascus or Tribeca or Harare or Rio de Janeiro or Paris or Mumbai or Baltimore or Montreal or Chester. And those things are done to them because they are women. Not women who've slipped up in any way whatsoever, but women who nonetheless are punished for being women. Now, violence against women in developing countries was exposed in part by Western feminists who used their privilege to add their voices and strength to politicise and to make public the often personal and hidden. And before I get called out for being on some kind of a white saviour ego trip, let me just say this. We should all be saviours. We should all pick up those who are not as strong as us. We should all do this in ways that ultimately enable and support all women in all cultures, globally. Because if we don't speak up with silent women, we're ultimately personally complicit in the disappearance via malnutrition, murder, infanticide, HIV, AIDS, of women that we'll never know, meet, or imagine. Our consumerist choices can have negative repercussions for factory workers in, say, Bangladesh. My £2 high street t-shirt costs far more than that in human terms. The first wave feminists, largely white, educated, middle-class women, saw their movement gain momentum from and develop alongside the abolitionist movement of the 19th century. Now, many waves and generations later, we need to be global feminists who ask awkward questions and expose the shaky structures that underpin neoliberal globalization. We have voices. Now that is the obligation of privilege. Thank you.
have a short time for questions to Emma. If you'll put your hand up if you wish to ask a question, we have some roving mics that will go around the auditorium for you to be heard.
My father-in-law said he prepared one on the recent form of Spurs. I think Harry Kane's doing pretty well, frankly.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Emma. That was absolutely brilliant. Absolutely loved it. Thank you.
Thank you.
As you know, my own research is on weight and dieting and things like that. And one of the things that I kind of come across in my research is women saying, you know, the reason I choose to lose weight is because it's empowering. You can kind of recite the kind of discourse that comes through. And they will also say to me that don't believe that I'm stupid. So it's not that I don't know what's happening in the kind of at the structural level. I know that there's fat phobia. I know that there's these kind of cultural discourses which are actually tailored in ways which may be oppressive to me, but nevertheless I experience this as empowering. So is there there's a question somewhere. So is there a kind of complexity in the kind of argument that you're making? And does this kind of like recourse to false consciousness have the problem of presenting women who do choose as somehow stupid?
No, I don't think it does. I think it, far from being stupidity, it's the superior economic and strategic machinations of neoliberalism, particularly advertising, particularly media, that make appear as natural. If you appear in this way, you will be more confident, you will be empowered, you will have all of those qualities. So I think it's not that those women are stupid. I think it's that as many of us do, we are duped by the massive multinational corporations that profit from actually making those insecurities appear natural in women. And socialization is one of the hardest things to kind of expose or to make clear to anybody. It's not about stupidity. It's about a degree of empower, because they're sold a version of empowerment that actually is about self-improvement, self-help. It's not. It's about the fact that, for example, austerity is a political choice, and austerity disempowers more women than it does men. So the real empowerment would be financial, but that wouldn't suit neoliberalism, and therefore that's not the one that's sold. So it is about how you look, how you present, and all that kind of stuff. Does that answer your question?
Anyone else?
Mark?
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering what you thought about Elizabeth Morrish and Sarah Ahmed recently in the Times
Yeah.
Square,
Yeah.
have expressed their need to be exiles from higher education, and you've written about exiles, I think, in your first book. And I wondered, in dialogue with that, what you felt the limits of 21st century feminism in HE would be.
Yeah, it's such a good question, and I have such utter respect for both of those women. I'm also intrigued by the fact that, I mean, it relates in some terms to the day without us yesterday, if I can just take us back a day, which was about women withdrawing their labour to show how important their labour is. And people were pointing out that for a lot of women in a lot of situations that was impossible, because if they're not unionised or if they're on 0 hours contract, that's a far riskier strategy than for somebody who isn't. And I think that I think Sarah Ahmed is fabulous, but I think that she was privileged, and I suspect she would be the first person to acknowledge that privilege, in being able to say, I can step away from my position in a university where, in the case of her institution, she saw accusations of sexual harassment by staff on students being utterly ignored. No matter what she was fighting to do, they were being overlooked. She felt that that was the ethical thing to do. But sometimes, in the reality, again, of a neoliberal culture, it's very hard to be ethical if we have families to look after, if we have mortgages to pay. So I totally admire what she's done. I admire what Liz Morris has more recently done, and I've really enjoyed her blogs for a long time. And they are calling very publicly attention to inherent problems in many British universities around sexual harassment. And this has been literally front page news over the last few days, those issues of sexual harassment. But resignation is an act of bravery, but also of privilege. Tony, 442, I think.
I do have ability to extend.
No, I know.
How does the UK compare in terms of the figures that you've showed earlier? How would the UK compare with other developed countries?
It's not something I've looked into in great depth, but I know that in North America there's a very, very similar pattern. You still have those structures in terms of female governance being round about 30%. And that's partly to do with a different system they've got there around tenure, which means that ordinary rules of retirement don't necessarily apply. So you can get people with very entrenched views and opinions remaining in universities with very powerful voices and in very powerful positions, perhaps for longer than you can in the UK. So it's possible that the UK might lead the way in terms of turning those statistics round.
What's your take on the recent debate on transgender and the issue of women?
What do you mean by the issue of women?
Is it a woman who's born, a man who's transferred into a woman, have the same experiences with a woman?
Yes, of course. Yeah. I think the only feminism that's ever going to move us forward is an inclusive feminism, and trans women are women and absolutely have a voice and a place and a point of view that has to be embraced in terms of solidarity. But what you've hit on really interestingly is that there is a factionalism there that is also breaking feminism. There are groups of feminists who call themselves radical feminists, a title I object to because I want to be a radical feminist, but I don't want to identify with them. And they are what's pejoratively known, but I don't mind being pejorative about them, as trans, exclusionary, revolutionary, radical feminists. And they will do everything they can to say a man can never become a woman. It's not a position that I obtain with. It's not a position that I have any truck with. It's not a position that I think has any part in modern feminism, because the bravery and the courage that it takes to recognise that one is in a gender that doesn't work, and to face all the prejudice that it takes to realise your authentic gender, I think is courageous and brilliant and brave. But it is an interesting question because it does fracture feminism too. Thank you.
Will you forgive me if we make that the last question? I'm being told that the chairing of the event is leaving a lot to be desired and we're running late. Can I invite Professor Judy Hayden, who is the Professor of English and Writing and the Director of the Women's Studies Programme at the University of Tampa, to give the vote of thanks, please?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm pleased to be here to speak on Emma's behalf. I just want to say that I warned Emma before I began that in some of the following details I'm going to present are alternate facts. Evidently, that's how we roll now in America. The cookie jar image behind me is not an academic image, that's true, but this cookie jar is an emblem, a symbol of what brought Emma and I together. We first met at the University of East Anglia, where we were both completing our doctorate degrees. Emma had at that time a dog, not just any dog, but a rather large, if not giant, German Shepherd called Maid. No one could say that dog had tiny paws. And I was then, and still am, rather timid of the canine type, particularly the large ones. Sometimes Emma would bring Meg into the English department, and I would see Emma and Meg from afar. I was at that time a senior resident tutor on the campus, and so I had my own flat. And one day, Emma came by and asked me if she could leave Meg with me. Just me and Meg. My first concern was what to do with such a large dog to keep it from devouring me. I was absolutely certain that any dog that big had to have a hankering for human flesh. So I opened the cookie jar, that cookie jar, and I began to feed Meg custard creams. And the next time Emma brought Meg by, I again fed her custard creams. And I was so successful in staving off Meg's desire for human flesh that I went out and stocked up on custard creams. And very soon, Meg became partial to that cookie jar. When Emma's graduation day arrived, I headed over to the venue to watch the ceremony. And as I mounted the stairs to the quad, I saw Emma and Meg. And unfortunately, Meg saw me. Meg immediately let out a fantastic roar. And since she was untethered, she broke from Emma's side and raced toward me like the Concord on a taxiway. Her big mouth was open, her tongue was sticking out, and it flapped with every bounce and bound she made toward me. And I knew this was it. I was terrified, and I had no custard creams. I just stood there paralyzed as this big German Shepherd charged. And oh, the howling. Mine, not hers. I saw Emma, cap in hand, her gown flapping against the breeze as she raced toward Meg. And once I found my legs, about the same time I turned and I bolted. And at that moment I heard Emma cry out, "No, don't run away, Judy, she loves you." Or maybe she loved my custard creams. I have remembered that day as the day Emma saved my life. And after this, we became more than colleagues. We became very good friends. And our mornings and sometimes the afternoons were spent over coffee, American style with real cream. And Meg, by this time, had learned if she tapped her nose fairly firmly against this cookie jar, she might just bounce off the lid and get another custard cream. But more importantly than all this is Emma and I became close friends, and she became, in the end, my mentor. She took me to conferences, and anyone who's given a conference paper for the first time knows how daunting that can be. And she sat there with me and supported me through the experience. She read the chapters of my dissertation and critiqued my English. She encouraged me to start publishing my work, and she helped me make it through that long journey through the dissertation. And every time I began obsessing over something small, she would remind me, this is only one step in a much longer journey. Move on. The cookie jar traveled with me from England to America, and it sits now in my china cabinet in Florida, where it serves as a reminder of that moment in my life, of the finer things, of the importance of collegiality and of mentorship. I was not surprised as I watched Emma move through the ranks here at Chester. I am not surprised that she has become an international scholar of some repute. I have seen her teach. I have watched her students respond to her. I have watched her as she mentored students, and I have read her fantastic scholarship. Emma is a wonderful teacher, scholar, and represents the epitome of excellence. I aspire to be like her. And so let me say, congratulations, Emma. You are amazing. Thank you.